I'm Robert Hunter. I've been in and out of government off and on for more than half a century, sometimes as a fly on the wall, sometimes the fly gets to mess around in the pudding. And I was in the Lyndon Johnson White House for a year working on education, believe it or not. All 4 years on the Jimmy Carter National Security Council staff, less 2 hours and 20 minutes, and then 4.5 years as ambassador to NATO. I'm going to talk about something that happened when I was on the NSC staff in charge of the Middle East from 1979 to 1981, the moment that Jimmy Carter had to leave the presidency. I was in charge of Middle East, but that was everything but Iran. I had a colleague, Gary Sick. He was an intelligence officer for the Navy. He had the Iran account. He got the short stick. I had the rest of it. I had the easy stuff, Arab-Israeli peacemaking, easy stuff. Now, incidentally, I've now been involved in that for 52 years, and someday I'm going to get it right. But that's one of the enduring tragedies in the world. In fact, I often say if you want to make sure that you're going to be employed for the rest of your life, go into Arab-Israeli peacemaking. It's guaranteed. Well, while this was going on, I decided that we needed to have some kind of overall strategic perspective for what was going on in the Middle East. Now, back in those days, the NSC staff was small. We had a total of 60 people. It's now 6 times larger, which means people don't have a chance to integrate anything. Back then, we had 2 people who worked on the Middle East, which meant we had to, quote, think strategically, and we had to think like the president. What do I need to do that will go to the President of the United States so he will have some kind of grip on what's going on? Well, in the middle of this, we had a couple of things happen. 4th of November, 1979, the middle of the Iranian Revolution, a bunch of so-called students seized the American embassy in Tehran and kept our people hostage. 54 people were kept hostage for 444 days, and kept hostage, in fact, until the stroke of noon on the day that Jimmy Carter left the presidency, so the Ayatollah could ultimately humiliate the American president. Okay, so we had that happen. Then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Whether they did it in part because we were otherwise preoccupied, I don't know. Well, the entire United States government was working on the Iranian hostage crisis. It was the most intense diplomatic effort by the United States in our history, at least until that time. And I had my colleague, Gary Sick, who was working that account, and I had the rest of it. And at that point, the Arab-Israeli was kind of in abeyance, so I said, well, wait a second. We got to come up with something that might actually help to move the ball forward beyond where we are. So I got together a small team. I invited Bob Murray, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. I got Mike Sterner, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in that period, to come over. I got Bob Ames, who is the National Intelligence Officer at the CIA, who tragically was blown up in the embassy in Beirut 4 years later. And I got a senior general out of the Pentagon. So we had kind of a little interagency group all by ourselves. And we started gaming out what should be done for the president and for the nation, while everybody else is preoccupied with this. Everybody preoccupied with this. In fact, a little sidebar, which you can cut out if you want, to illustrate how intense this was, at one point, somebody came to us in the White House and said, back in the year dot, the Prophet Muhammad wrote a letter to the head man up in Istanbul, or Constantinople it was, because they hadn't taken it over yet. And we have found this letter from Muhammad. And the thought was, gosh, if we could get a hold of that letter from Muhammad, and then we might be able to trade that to the Ayatollah Khomeini for American hostages. Well, that's kind of cocky, maybe, but I got given the task. Well, among other things, I had to call down to Montego Bay in Jamaica and get the Saudi ambassador. Would they put up the money to buy the letter from Mohammed? Well, yes, they would, but then we looked at it, and sure enough, historically, there was a letter from Mohammed to this particular leader in Constantinople. Turned out, however, it was a fake, so it went nowhere. But it went way down the road. It was that kind of thing. Okay, back on track. So, sitting there saying, we need some kind of broader thing. And I came up with this idea in this little group. What we really need is, and I'm telegraphing a punch now, a Carter Doctrine for the Persian Gulf. We all agreed on that. We put some elements together, just our little group. Not the big interagency thing with going to the secretariat, just our little group, our little ginger group. So I sent a memo to my boss, Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor, and said, how about if we have a Carter Doctrine? He sent a memo back. He says, give me a memo, I can give it to the president. So I sat down and I said, oh, come on. I'm not just going to do that. I'm going to write it as though it were a speech. So I sat down with the typewriter, I didn't have computers in those days, and I wrote this speech about security for the Persian Gulf and the Middle East with the key elements in it, and I sent it to Brzezinski. Well, what I didn't realize, and this was the beginning of January of 1979, they were in the process of getting the president ready for the State of the Union address in January of 1979. So, and the president was having a meeting on this thing. And so Brzezinski goes and he has my draft. And there was a draft that come in from the State Department and begging everybody's pardon. Once you get anything cleared out of the State Department, if it isn't pablum, it's because somebody wasn't trying, which is, they're fantastic diplomats and negotiators, but as strategists, well, that's not where it gets done, actually. I'm sorry. A lot of the really good people and good ideas get dumbed down. That's a problem. Every administration has it. So the president, who read everything, read the State Department draft. Then he took the one that Brzezinski gave him. He lit up like this, and he said, I'm going with this. This is my State of the Union address. Came out of the meeting, and it was given to Rick Hertzberg, who was the chief speechwriter for the president. He looked like he'd been, I went over to see him. He looked like he'd been poleaxed. He'd had this wonderful draft all ready to go. He had to start fresh with what I did. Well, and history will show that before the joint session of the Congress of the United States, the President of the United States got up there and enunciated the Carter Doctrine, which was defined American strategy for the foreseeable future. Now, there's a very important element that people don't understand. The key element, which Brzezinski added, said, in effect, if the Soviet Union attacks any country beyond Afghanistan, we will consider that attack against us and we will act. Now think about that for a second. What that really meant was, if the Soviet Union goes into Iran, which was holding Americans hostage, we will fight for Iran to get the Soviets out. I don't know whether ever in history that has been done to give a security guarantee to a country that was hurting us at the time. Well, the Soviet Union did not attack Iran, and that began the process of running down the Soviet success in Afghanistan and eventually bringing the country to an end. Regrettably, we still haven't moved where we need to move in relationship with Iran.